Good morning, everyone. On the morning of the 22nd of October, 1844, hundreds of thousands of people woke up with a variety of emotions: excitement, dread, joy, hope, fear. Representing a cross-section of society, they met up in homes and churches, old and young, rich and poor, farmers and factory workers, slaves and free. What they all had in common was a fervent belief in the teachings of William Miller, a self-taught preacher from Massachusetts. For Miller's followers, it was the end of the world. It had all been worked out. They were wrong. We are a storytelling species. Narrative is how we make sense of the world. So it's little wonder that we take such an interest in the ending. We are interested in all things apocalyptic. At the moment, existential threats seem to be everywhere. We are, in the words of the Prime Minister a few weeks ago, at 1 minute to midnight. Despite the relative peace of the last few decades, we may feel that there is some undeniable sense in which there's a tension between progress and destruction. We may be anxious about the blistering pace of change, technological change, demographic change, cultural change. We shared an act of remembrance this morning, remembering those lives lost to conflict. But of course, the destruction and brutality of war isn't a thing of the past, and we're all too aware of violence around the world. We may not be living in a state of war, but it's easy to see why we may not feel at peace, both as individuals and as society. This morning, I'd like us to reflect on this apocalyptic passage from Mark, what it meant for its initial audience, and what it says to us today. Fittingly for this Remembrance Sunday, this passage was likely written in the midst of, or shortly after, a destructive, and for the Jewish people of Palestine at least, an apocalyptic war. The destruction of the temple occurred in AD 70, after Roman forces had been fighting in Palestine on and off for several years. I think I've said this before, but the temple in Jerusalem was so much more than just a building, more than a place of worship. It provided identity, structure, and meaning. It was the religious, political, economic, cultural, and national center for Jewish people. It was the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, the Bank of England, the British Museum, Westminster Abbey, all rolled into one, and then some. During World War II, the bright stones of Stormont were covered with a mixture of cow dung and bitumen to make it harder for bombers to use the building as a navigational aid when attacking Belfast. The first century Jewish forces in Jerusalem couldn't exactly disguise or hide the temple. The building dominated the city. When it fell, it's almost impossible to understate the impact it would have had. So the first point I'd like us to understand this morning is that this passage certainly wasn't written with us in mind. Mark is writing for a first century audience scarred by war. This passage and the rest of the chapter 2, it's not so much a passage about the literal end of our world, as much as it is a passage about the metaphorical end of their world. Not about the literal end of our world, but about the metaphorical end of their world. But of course, none of the Bible was written with us specifically in mind. And just because a passage is rooted in the events and language of the past, doesn't mean it can't speak to us today. The fall of Herod's temple and all the cultural, economic, military, political, and theological implications it brought with it doesn't necessarily mean that much to us. But I'd like to suggest that 2,000 years on, Our lives are still filled with temples. Our temples are those things, those relationships, institutions, structures, concepts, which give our lives meaning, value, security, and order. Our status, our job, our opinions, our nationality, our possessions, our bodies even. So many giant stones go into those temples which make us, us. And some of our temples, our individual temples and our collective societal temples, may be crumbling, or at least we may be able to see the cracks. Things change, people disappoint, institutions collapse, relationships fail, our bodies weaken. I spoke a few minutes ago about the existential threats of climate change. Many of us may feel in our own lives that we're only a few steps from breakdown, that we're only just holding it all together. We may feel burdened by a personal sense of doom or hopelessness. So let's consider Jesus's words in the Gospel of Mark and why they are words of warning, but also of comfort and hope. I'd like us to focus on just 3 little phrases which Jesus says. Watch out that no one deceives you. Do not be alarmed. These are the beginning of birth pains. First off, the warning. Watch out that no one deceives you. Jesus goes on to say that many will come in his name, claiming, I am he. Now, I'd like to think if a bloke popped up in one of our local churches claiming to be Jesus, our collective response would be something along the lines of, he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. Generally speaking, we're unlikely to come across people claiming to be Jesus. Despite this, I'd like to suggest this morning that these words, do not be deceived, have rarely been so important. We are people who have access to and are bombarded by more information than any other people in history. It's said that truth is the first casualty of war. Well, we live in an age where misinformation is used as a weapon of war, even in peacetime, to undermine society's very faith in itself. Millions of people have, through careful, cynical targeting, been made afraid, angry, and untrusting. We've all seen what happens when people are deceived. Faith in democracy, faith in institutions, faith in science, faith in leaders, faith in the very concept of truth is eroded and replaced by ignorance, hatred, distrust, and conspiracy theory. Much of this deception occurs online, but it's having real-world consequences. It's often said, and it remains true, that people are entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts, much less their own alternative facts. Watch out. As followers of Jesus, we are to place a huge value on truth. All truth is God's truth. We need to make sure we're not deceived by falsehood and that we stand up for the truth. So what does this mean for us in our daily lives? In an age where we're subject to so much information, we need to be careful. We need to educate ourselves about how we know what we know. We need to check our sources, fact check where we're unsure, and remain aware of our own biases. We shouldn't just blindly forward articles, memes, or news stories that we've been sent, for example. And in a faith context too, we are subject to so much information and often contradictory teaching. How are we to spot truth in this context? Well, That's a very big question, but I'd suggest that perhaps we need to start considering the likely fruits of the teaching that we're hearing. If it promotes love, hope, healing, wholeness, growth, unity, and challenge, I'd suggest that the fruits of the teaching will be good. If, however, it promotes the interests of the powerful, if it fosters hatred, anger, division, hopelessness, and fear, I'd suggest we're at risk of being deceived. This leads us into consideration of the second of Jesus's little phrases. Do not be alarmed. Don't be afraid. That's easy for you to say, Jesus. You don't have to doom scroll through 24-hour news feeds on your iPhone. And when I was preparing this sermon, I couldn't help but think of Corporal Jones shouting, "Don't panic, don't panic." How can we not be alarmed? And indeed, shouldn't we be alarmed? So many people in the church today are scared. They're scared of societal change, and they're looking for something or someone to blame. They remind me of how I imagine the disciples on the evening of Good Friday, cowed and terrified about the future. There's a touch of the Private Fraser about them. We're doomed. What does Jesus say here? And indeed on so many other occasions. Do not be alarmed. Don't be afraid. So why shouldn't we be controlled by fear? Because our faith, our trust is in the God of creation. We trust, we have faith in a God who created a world with change baked into its very fabric, a God who can fashion good out of any situation, however apocalyptic, a God who turned a symbol of oppression and torture into one of self-sacrifice and freedom, a God who turned a symbol of violence and death into one of peace and abundant, all-conquering life. That's why we should not be afraid. But of course, fear is a natural, innate response too. Sometimes it's impossible for us to reason our way out of fear, as anyone who suffered from anxiety will know. And fear can, in moderation, be helpful. Fear can provoke a response, and at times this is what's needed, both as individuals and as society. Facing apocalyptic events, whether ones affecting just us or us all, should cause us to consider the very meaning of the word itself, apocalypse. It means revelation. An apocalypse, or the threat of it, should reveal something to us. To use a topical and obvious example, the threats of climate change reveal that we have damaged our world through our actions. And this brings me to the third and final phrase I'd like us to consider. Jesus says, excuse me, that all these wars and disasters are the beginning of birth pains. Birth pains, the pain that women go through before experiencing the joy of new life. It's this new life, this new creation, that's at the heart of our faith. We are Easter people, people whose faith and hope and focus should be on the joy of birth, not the pain beforehand, on the hope, not the horror. What was Jesus getting at here? Well, without getting into too much deep theology at this late stage of the sermon, Jewish people essentially divided up history into two periods. The present age, which was imperfect and unjust and violent, and the age to come, where God would be in full control and there would be justice and peace, God's kingdom. As followers of Jesus, we believe that we can contribute to that age to come, the kingdom of God, right here and right now. We trust in a God who calls us collectively forward to build a better world, building up God's kingdom. It's this hope of new life after the birth pains which is central to our faith. Our hope shouldn't be some naive hope that God will magically come to our aid. And our hope is not an excuse for inaction. If we're going to avoid apocalyptic outcomes in our personal lives or as society, or if we're going to rebuild after such events, we need to have the audacity to hope that things can get better, that God's kingdom can come. Audacious hope. Hope can direct our fears into action for change. Hope can direct our fears into action for change. Hope says that we can and will make a difference. On the morning of the 24th of June, 1948, Soviet forces sealed off every road, rail, and canal access point to West Berlin. They assumed that the Allies would quickly abandon the city and its 2 million inhabitants. What else could they do? Faced with this disastrous situation, some military men had an audacious idea. Logic said that it was impossible. History said that it had never been attempted before, much less succeeded. Operation Plainfare was the Royal Air Force's contribution to the plan to break the Berlin blockade by fully supplying the city with everything it needed solely by air. Soviets didn't consider for a second that it could succeed, but somehow the United States Air Force and the RAF were eventually able to supply up to 5,000 tons of material, food, and coal every day. Over 600 planes flew a combined distance of almost 92 million miles. That's almost the distance from the Earth to the sun. At the height of the campaign, a plane landed in West Berlin every 30 seconds. 70 British and American servicemen died, along with 15 civilians. A memorial to their sacrifice still stands in Berlin. That hope is something which we, as followers of Jesus, should try to embody when we're faced with apocalyptic events. None of us knows the time in cosmic terms. To borrow one of Churchill's lines, we don't know if it's the beginning of the end or merely the end of the beginning. As we face our falling or fallen temples this morning, as we face our futures as individuals and our collective future as society, let's remember the importance of not being deceived and the value of truth. Let's try not to be alarmed. With our trust in God, let's be comforted that neither death nor life, neither climate change nor cyber attack, neither the present nor the future, nor economic wars, nor economic collapse, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. And as we consider our poppies, let us remember that they are a symbol not just of loss and remembrance, but also of the audacious hope of a peaceful future. Let us commit ourselves this morning to embodying that hope of new life and peace in a world that so badly needs it. Amen.